No silly intros today.
Bobby.
This is serious business.
Bobby. Bobby.
Receiving the hard train. Yo, Bobby. Yo, listen, Bobby. Yo, listen, Bobby. Bobby.
What's up, guys? This is Chopping Fables with Bobby Agua. I'm your host, Bobby Agua, and as I said, no stupid intros today. This isn't a one of the fun, act your wage or can men and women be friends or idiots having kids type of shows today. Today we're handling a really heavy topic. I had mentioned to somebody else earlier in the day when I told them that I would be recording this, that I had finally mentally prepared myself to record this, that it wasn't an episode that I'm looking forward to making. Actually, I had avoided this one for quite some time. And I've avoided talking about the topic with almost everybody. First and foremost, as I said, this is Chopping Fables with Bobby Agua. I'm Bobby Agua, so thank you for listening. As always, I really, really appreciate any listens, any fans that I have through this. This isn't going to be the typical episode, like I said, but this episode in particular, and to a point, this podcast as a whole is dedicated to a really good friend of mine named Brian Simpson. He was a friend of mine for about 4 years, and in March passed away from a heroin overdose. And that's going to be our topic today, is the heroin epidemic. What really brought it on, and it's kind of sad and halfway corny that the topic of heroin addiction was brought into the forefront this past week when singer and entertainer Demi Lovato was rushed to the hospital from a suspected, alleged heroin overdose. Now, since then, her people have said, well, we don't know that it was heroin and blah, blah, blah. Like, of course you're going to say that. You're seeing your cash cow literally slipping through your fingers, and heroin isn't exactly the glamorous drug that it was in the early 90s, And so when I heard that news, it just brought in a whole flood of emotions. So, I'm the type that I will, when I get bad news or when somebody passes away or when anything negative kind of rears its ugly head into my life, I have a habit of disassociating and completely just shutting down that part of my brain, right? I don't want to internalize it. I don't want to acknowledge that it happened. I almost completely forget that person, place, or thing ever even existed. And I'm finding it really difficult to do that with Brian's memory. First and foremost, let me say that this is going to be a heavy episode. The topic will be heroin throughout its entirety. If that's too heavy for you, like I've said in every single previous podcast, if this ain't the episode for you, just skip it. I'll get to something, fun and enjoyable and lighthearted a little bit later this week. I was saying that I didn't even want necessarily this episode to get too much attention. This is one that I'm kind of doing more for me and in memory of Brian than I'm doing it as a part of this project that I've undertaken. So if it's just going to drum up a bunch of negative feelings, and I'm not going to argue with people about this, you know what I mean, as far as my feelings for it, because quite honestly, this episode is more for me than it is for you guys, right? And I'll very rarely, if ever, do anything like that again, but this one's for me, and this one's for him. Right. The next thing that I wanted to bring up and kind of bring to the light was I'm comfortable talking about Brian's heroin addiction and the way that he died, because his mother actually published a story, I believe it was in her local newspaper. It is basically almost like an op-ed piece about him and about his addiction and the way that he died. So everything that I'm saying is very, very public knowledge. Like, I'm not into outing somebody's anonymity, especially where things like drug addiction or overdose or anything like that is concerned, right? Like, everybody's heard about Demi. Anybody who cares to know about Brian's history, it's all very easily verifiable and was posted and published by the person who was probably the closest to him in the world, which was his mother. So that's the only reason that I'm really comfortable about speaking about his issues specifically and how he pertained to my life. We spoke every single day. I have a tendency to record these extremely late at night. Right now it's 1:07 in the morning. And I do these at this time because I've stayed up this late for quite some time. I was never one to be with my wife as far as like, oh, well, I got the baby last time, so now it's your turn. And like, I get 2 hours of sleep, and then she gets 2 hours of sleep, and then I get 2 hours. Like, I'm not about that. And my schedule lends itself to me staying up super late so that she can get some decent sleep for an extended period of time. And then once I'm asleep, right? And Brian had an insomnia issue. He found it very difficult to fall asleep. So I would tell him, hey, dude, I'm up until 2, 3, sometimes 4 o'clock in the morning. Like, hit me up. Like, this is the time that I'm not running around chasing kids and being a father of 2 and everything else. You know what I mean? Like, this is the perfect time. And he would every single night. I was able to transcribe all of our Facebook messages into a single Microsoft Word document and got, I think the count was at like 250,000 words and 1,200 pages of text between the two of us. Like, we spoke every single night. And I knew that he had this addiction issue, right? We were very candid about both of our pasts, which I haven't gone into mine very much, because I do want this to be an extension of myself as Bobby Agua and not actually Rob the man. You know what I mean? But I felt very comfortable talking about things like that with him because I knew that he was fighting his own demons that I had overcome, right? First of all, let me be very frank and forward. I have never tried heroin. I've never injected a drug in my life. And so I didn't understand where he was coming from that particular perspective, but I could empathize. And I understood the process insofar as I understood the mentality behind it because I knew what it was like to obsess over things and make that thing your entire life. And that's really what heroin does to people. It steals the person from themselves and makes them a series of motivational properties. My only motivation to live today is to get high. And he was very candid about that. And, you know, he was an open book. He wanted people to know what this drug had done to him. And he was very accepting of what he had done to himself. He was always very introspective insofar that he understood that he kind of threw his own hand in all of this, you know, and now he was just stuck. He was just, this is what life was for Brian at this point. So first of all, to those who don't know, I do kind of want to give an introduction to opiates insofar as like what they do physiologically. So people who use heroin report feeling a rush of sorts, like a surge of pleasure, euphoria, cloudy-headedness, just this amazing feeling. But there are other common side effects. You get dry mouth really bad, your skin flushes out, you start feeling very heavy in your extremities, in your arms and legs. Nausea and vomiting is a huge thing. Anybody who either has had experience with opiates themselves or knows somebody knows the term being dope sick. And when you're coming down and beginning the withdrawal process, it's very common to become dope sick, where you actually have physiological reactions of not having that drug in your system. You start vomiting super violently, and you get stomach cramps and severe itching. It's why you see a lot of heroin addicts with boils on their skin. They'll inject just underneath the skin, and then they will begin to pick at the sores and things like that are left behind. That severe itching is almost like an OCD thing. Like a lot of them don't realize that they're doing it, and they'll pick at their arms or they'll pick at their face real bad. And we've all seen, the faces of meth. And if you haven't, just Google image search faces of meth, and it's very good looking people just completely becoming ravaged by this drug. Obviously, like things like clouded mental functioning, and one of the biggest side effects is what they call going on the nod. And it's a back and forth state of being conscious, semi-conscious, unconscious, back again. And it's that nod that you get. Think of somebody just like, we've all seen people who are like super, super sleepy, and maybe they were sitting in a chair, and you just kind of get that nod back and forth, between barely conscious and unconscious. And you see that a lot during the euphoric stage of the heroin use, right after administration. Obviously, there are some long-term effects of people who use heroin over a long period of time. As I mentioned, they may develop insomnia, which Brian did. You have collapsed veins for people who inject the drug. So I worked at a hospital in downtown Louisville for a time, and I was able to work in the ER. And very often there were drug seekers, people who were just in the ER to try and score opiates in their pill forms. There were people who had drug problems in the past, and maybe they were getting clean and something happened to them, Whatever the case was, there was a patient who was talking to a nurse, and the nurse was going to try and draw blood, and she asked what gauge needle she was going to use, and the nurse had answered that person, and they said, "Oh, you'll never get in there with that gauge. I usually use another gauge." And they were literally talking back and forth because the girl had collapsed so many veins from heroin use. And they were literally talking in medical terms about the gauge of the needle that she thought she would be able to use because she had so many unusable, collapsed, very thin, almost dead veins. And the comfortability in which this person was talking was astounding to me at the time. It was like she was reading off a grocery list. It was like, we shouldn't have been shocked at the fact, like, yep, I know all about this stuff, and you're not going to be able to get in with that. And if you let me do it, I'm just going to get it faster. And you know what I mean? And it was surprising to me how removed from reality this individual was. Like, you're in a hospital, let us take care of you. But you also may very well know more about injecting yourself than a full-time registered ER nurse. So obviously the collapsed veins are a huge thing. damaged tissue inside of the nose for people who sniff or snort it. This is known as a deviated septum, where the cartilage will actually eat the drugs will eat away the cartilage in between your nose, and you actually have just one big nostril instead of two. You still have two holes coming out of your nose, obviously, but all of the cartilage on the inside has just completely eroded away from snorting heroin. The same thing can happen with cocaine and things like that. Infection of the heart lining, abscesses, liver and kidney disease, sexual dysfunction for men, getting heroin dick, it's all just bad news bears. So I wanted to talk about the heroin epidemic insofar that we need the ways that we are trying to treat this disease aren't working. Nobody wants to talk about it, yet it seems that so many people, since the inception of me doing this episode, so the day that Demi Lovato was rushed to the hospital, I had decided it's time. I need to face Brian's death head on. I need to talk about it. I need to say his name. And this needs to come out because too many people have a heroin story. They have been affected by it in some way or another, whether it's themselves, whether it's a sibling, whether it was a friend, whether it was a parent. So many people have an opioid story. And that leads me to believe, strictly based on facts, that the way that we're handling this situation, or lack thereof, in my opinion, is not working. Jail time is not working for these people. Even rehab centers, you have about a 40% chance of relapsing when it's any other random drug. You have about an 80% chance of relapsing with heroin, which I know Brian did several times. He'd go through these periods of sobriety, and I always made sure to tell him how proud I was of him and how impressed I was that he was able to kick it. And eventually it would just rear back its ugly head. And of course, he, like every other addict, assured me that he knew what his tolerance was and what he could handle, and he was in complete control. And it's like, dude, you're fucking injecting heroin in between your goddamn toes. Like you're anything but in control of your life at this point. And it's really hard to see a person that you care about go down that rabbit hole. And there's nothing that you can do about it, or at least nothing that we've figured out so far that works. There are some things that have proven to be better than nothing, however, and I wanted to talk about the idea of methadone. So methadone is it works by binding to the same opioid receptors in the brain as heroin, but more weakly, so that it reduces cravings and withdrawal symptoms. So you can technically, I suppose, get high off of methadone, is my understanding, right? And I'm only going based on the little bit of research and the just the personal stories that other people have told me. So if I have something wrong, please, please, please don't hesitate to let me know, right? But my understanding is that methadone works as a sort of harm reduction, right? I might not want my son, when he's older, to get a Kawasaki Ninja motorcycle. So I'll get him a fucking moped. You know what I mean? Like, I'm still not crazy about him riding the scooter around, but it's better than a bike that can go 170 miles an hour, however fast these fucking things go, So it's harm reduction. I'm still not crazy about methadone, but it's a hell of a lot better than heroin, and I'd rather have a bunch of methadone addicts walking around than a bunch of heroin addicts. because it doesn't, it binds to those receptors in a different way, and at least reduces the cravings and the withdrawal symptoms. It prevents people from getting dope sick. And many times when people quit heroin, the reason that they go back is because they couldn't handle the withdrawal symptoms. You know, most people have quit some sort of addictive substance or behavior at some point in their life. Maybe you used to smoke cigarettes. Maybe you used to gamble and you just don't anymore. Maybe, you know, you used to shop a lot more than you do before you had kids or something like that. Most of us have quit some kind of addictive property or substance or behavior or what have you. Heroin withdrawal is one of the ugliest things that I've ever witnessed. Brian wasn't my only friend who has had problems with heroin, but he is the only one that I'm comfortable speaking about, just because of, like I said, that publication that his mother ended up doing. But I've witnessed people go through heroin withdrawal, and it's fucking disgusting. The things that they go through, I would not wish on my worst enemy. And methadone helps with that. The problem that arises is that we're treating the symptoms. Heroin addiction is just a symptom many times, overwhelming amount of times. It's just a symptom of an underlying problem at hand. You're putting a headache on you're putting a Band-Aid on a headache. And when you do that, you're not treating the reasoning behind it. You're solely treating the visible effects of of the problem. So along with the methadone or whatever they have a couple different types of drugs that work in this harm reduction fashion, stuff like buprenorphine and things like that will help with the different withdrawal symptoms. But more than that, you have to look into things like individual therapy and substance abuse treatment, where group settings are involved, where you can talk with other heroin addicts and things like that, getting a sponsor, working steps and things. And even with all of those things, even with all of the resources at your disposal, you still have an 80% chance of going back. So obviously even that is not enough. The idea that you can and you know what, and I told Brian this several times, the idea that you can white knuckle yourself off of heroin is insane. Nobody's that strong. It just doesn't exist in nature. You will never find somebody who said, yeah, I was able to kick opiates and heroin specifically, and I never had to go to any rehab. I never had to work any steps. I don't have a spot. Like, they don't exist in nature. It's not going to happen. The cravings are too strong, the withdrawal symptoms are too hard, and those underlying properties are still at work. So even if by some ridiculous stretch of the imagination there was one of these people, it's almost guaranteed that they've just replaced that addiction with something else. Okay, great, you're not a heroin addict, but you're going to the gambling boat 4 times a week, you know? The idea of substituting addictions is not foreign. It happens quite often. I just wanted to throw out, everybody knows at this point, I'm a facts guy, right? And I love numbers. And so the idea of there being a lot of quantifiable research on this topic was very interesting to me and very attractive to me. And so I wanted to throw out some of the more surprising statistics. So the National Survey on Drug Use and Health indicates that nearly 5.1 million people used heroin in 2015. If you got 100 people in a room, and that's not a very big room, right? If you got 100 people in it, one of them's used heroin. At least one, possibly two. In that 100-person room in the last year. That's insane. For something that we swear will never happen to us, never happen to anybody that we love, it almost certainly has or is currently to you. You know 100 people. One of them has used heroin in the last year. Think about that. If you know 200 people, then you get where I'm going with this. And it's because it's such a stigma. It's because it's the injections and the dope sickness and the behavioral stuff that goes along with it, stealing and robbing people and everything like that, that people, understandably so, think that they can't talk about these things. I can't go, who the fuck would understand that I have a heroin addiction like I'm on my own? Heroin abuse is reaching epidemic proportions. According to the National Institute on Drug Abuse, deaths due to heroin overdose increased more than 600% between 2002 and 2015. There are very few things in this world that have increased sixfold in the past 13 years. Heroin abuse is one of them. There are literally bodies littering the streets in places like the Heroin Triangle, just outside of Atlanta, Georgia. Small towns all across the United States. One of them, about 20 to 30 minutes away from my house, becoming locally famous for the opiate problems that they are having in their communities. This is not what I want our communities to be famous for. We had the most heroin overdose deaths last year in the state or in the country. An article from The Atlantic that quotes various studies indicates that heroin abuse by women, people in higher tax brackets, income brackets, and people on private insurance has increased. This isn't crack, which was its own epidemic and deserved 1,000 podcasts in New York in the mid-'80s and didn't get the attention. This isn't something that is affecting poor, disenfranchised, ne'er-do-well people. It is, but it's not only affecting them. It's affecting everybody. It's the librarian down the street. It's your next door neighbor who goes to work every day and tries to earn an honest living and then comes home and skin pops, you know. This is lawyers, this is doctors, this is nurses, this is firefighters, this is, believe it or not, police officers. Sure, absolutely. This isn't relegated to Skid Row. Not that, and I don't want the message to be misconstrued, not that it would make it any less serious if it was. I'm trying to make this personal, because it is personal. You most likely know somebody who's tried heroin in the last year, period. The statistics are there. You know 100 people. Men are more likely than women to overdose, with deaths due to heroin overdose 4 times more likely in men than women. And this most likely comes from the idea of that Brian had. I got this, dude. I know how much I can use. You know what I mean? There was this whole heroin chic movement in, I believe it was like the late 80s, early 90s, I want to say, where it was considered cool because models were snorting it and it kept you skinny and blah, blah, blah. And so I do have a tendency to think that even though women use it more often, if heroin use can be a socially used thing, I would think it would be more socially used by women and more hardcore balls to the wall, I'm invincible, nothing's gonna touch me used by men. The idea that, like I said, the point isn't who they are, but the fact that what they're governed by, internally, cerebrally, all we are a series of motivational properties in the brain. I wake up in the morning and I eat breakfast because I'm hungry. There is a cause, there is an effect, there is an action, there is a reaction. I am hungry, therefore I will eat. And that's how it works in most of our brains. The problem is that heroin disrupts that behavior and the use of certain natural chemicals in the brain. And that results in these pathways becoming dependent upon the use of heroin to continue functioning. We've all heard the stories of the lab rats who, when they press a button with their nose, they get a hit of narcotic or they get a hit of opiates. It releases that chemical in their brain. And when they realize that pushing that button with their nose releases, that there is that cause and effect, the wiring in their brain is so scrambled that they will literally starve to death while pressing that button. They will not eat, they will not sleep, they will not do anything except to get that serotonin, to get that dopamine, to get that opiate effect. Humans are very similar. Once you've opened that Pandora's box, nothing else matters. We have a tendency as a society to say this is their fault, and if you don't want to be an addict, then you should probably stop using. I'm not going to argue what is an addict or what is their fault or isn't their fault. I'm simply going to say that would be like me telling you to stop eating. You're hungry. It wouldn't make sense for me to tell you to stop eating. It's a motivational property that has been wired into your brain. These people's wires are crossed. The dependence upon this function can lead to the individual being unable to control heroin use, including the amounts used, the frequency of use, and being unable to stop the use. This is the hallmark of addiction, and that came from that same Atlantic article that I had cited earlier. Addiction, to me, I heard this this quote, this definition from Dr. Drew, famous celebrity rehab doctor, Loveline, all that. I heard him say once that addiction is defined by continued actions in the face of negative consequences. And I really liked that because two different people can be exhibiting the same actions, and yet one could be addicted and one might not be. If a guy brings home a six-pack and his wife tells him, if you keep on drinking, I'm going to leave you, and he has that six-pack anyway, it is not the same as the guy who brings home the 24-pack and if his wife gives him a kiss and his kids all run up to him and they're happy to see him home and the wife doesn't have any problem with it and they're able to make their bills. There are no negative consequences there. I would be pressed to say that the individual drinking the 6-pack is an alcoholic and the individual drinking the 24-pack is not. Because there are not those negative effects. There aren't those negative consequences that you are using in the face of. Heroin's almost always going to have negative consequences. There is no such thing as an old heroin addict. There are old alcoholics, right? They might not be in the best shape, but at least they made it there. With the heroin addicts, it destroys every part of their life. There is not somebody who can casually use heroin and not have it result in some sort of negative consequence. Everybody who uses heroin is an addict, in my opinion. And so therefore, we need to figure out what we can do about this. This isn't the people who have no families. This is not the people who had just the shittiest hand dealt to them in life. These are people who had shitty things happen to them. And these are hurt people. These are victims. And I understand that it's hard to look at them like that when you see the nodding and you see the skin pops and you see the picked up sores and picked off sores and things like that. You know, it's very difficult to see these people as victims because we're so used to making people take acceptance for their behaviors and taking responsibility for their actions. And I'm all about accountability, but these people shouldn't be held accountable for something that happened to them. And in almost every case, something happened to them. As a society, we need to figure out a better way to fix this, or those 100 people that you know will turn into 99 very quickly. There are no old heroin addicts. It's another Fable Chop, man. This was a really hard episode for me to get to. Just to tell you guys a little bit about Brian, man. Like, oh God, this is hard, man. Brian was a really good dude. The term spirit animal gets thrown around a lot, just like somebody that you have a whole lot in common with, and just your experiences have mirrored each other's, and maybe you guys were into the same pop culture and you had a lot of things in common in that way. That was Brian for me, for sure. So, a huge influence of even having this podcast was the show Loveline. It was a show that I listened to from probably the mid 90s to like the early 2000s, 2 or 3, you know. And it was a show that was in Chicago. It was on Q101 at night, and it was with Adam Carolla and Dr. Drew. And I listened to this show every single night when I was falling asleep, mostly because I was like 13 and they'd talk about sex and blowjobs and da-da-da-da. But like, they were talking to me about the shit my parents weren't talking to me about, and I needed to find it out from somewhere, you know? And it was cool that like these adults were giving, you know, teenagers and young adults actual answers on their questions. It wasn't, I'll tell you when you get older, you know what I mean? And so because of that, I was exposed to a lot very young, but I had a lot of the answers very young as well, which I was extremely happy with. And Brian was the only person who knew that show almost as well as I do, and better than I did in certain aspects. We would literally go back and forth and ask each other Loveline trivia that we could remember from 15 years ago. You know, this individual specific show had such an impact on both of us. And then the other thing was battle rap. That's where I met him, was through a battle rap group. Like an online message board, basically. And it really impressed him that I've been involved in some form or facet in battle rap as a fan, since probably 2004, and been really active in the battle scene and in the behind the scenes stuff, since probably 2007 or 8. Like, I've met a lot of these guys. I've talked to a lot of these guys. A lot of them I would consider personal friends. And so he was really big into the battle rap, but had just gotten into it. So he would ask me about references. Oh, this guy said this, but I didn't get it. Like, what does that mean? And I would send him the link to the original battle that was being referenced in the future battle. And, he was a really talented rapper in his own right. He was always writing. He was a very creative guy. And in a lot of ways, he had become one of my best friends, and that's a topic that I'm going to bring up in a future episode, because I never met the guy in person, but we had forged such a relationship online, that it's very difficult for me now to stay up and not hear my phone go off at some point during the night, and have one last love line trivia, not have one last question about battle rap, and to know that I'm never going to get that message ever again is very difficult for me to deal with. And I don't know that I'll ever really get over that. Like, 28-year-old guys aren't supposed to die. And when he did, it really, really affected me. And I knew, I knew when I started this podcast that this was going to be one of those episodes. I needed it to be one of those episodes. Just for my own sanity and well-being and mental state. I can't hold this shit in. I need to talk about this. And if you know somebody, or you suspect, first of all, if you suspect that somebody is on heroin, they're probably on fucking heroin. And you need to do whatever you can do in order to get them help. I understand that at this point of their relationship, if it's gotten so bad that you can see it, they've probably burned a bridge or two with you as it is. They're hurt. They're hurting. They're victims. They need your help, and they don't know how to ask for it. If they did, they wouldn't be heroin addicts. This isn't something somebody chooses. This isn't something somebody wakes up and says, hey, I want to be a heroin addict today. I want to have no cartilage left in between my nose, and I want fucking sores on my face, be 80 fucking pounds soaking wet with batteries in my pockets. Like, nobody thinks like that. And you really do. You have to do whatever you can to get them help. Because I've seen big, and I've seen strong, and I've seen them die. So, again, guys, thank you for listening. Your support means the world to me. I love all of you, and keep chopping fables, man.